All right, welcome back to everyone. So this is a great topic. Charlemagne, actually one of the more famous people I cover in all my courses. This is, of course, the story of this very powerful king, king of the Franks, the Carolingian Empire. He ruled, as you could see there, from 768 to 814, and it's a name a lot of my students know about, but not necessarily know all the details about his life and what he did and why he was important. So in this short lecture, I want to kind of go through that, make sure you know that, know the details about what he did and the significance of his rulership. Now, the first thing I want to start with when we talk about Charlemagne is where do we get information about him from? And this is part of the story that makes it a little interesting. So we have this man named Einhard, and Einhard writes this biography of Charlemagne. Now, when you read it, I'm going to kind of have the right in front of me. Very often, you read the passages from Einhard, and frankly, depict Charlemagne in very wonderful terms. So, as a student, when you read this in my class, all my students are required to read bits of Einhard for courses. And for those of you who are not my students just watching this, I'll even share the link in the discussion in the comments there so you can find it and you can read it. Because when you first read Einhard, he depicts Charlemagne in very positive terms as being a very generous person, as somebody who's very strong and friendly and caring and all of these things. I'll read just a couple quick things like how he described how his appearance looks. So this is how he describes his appearance, which I think is pretty telling. He says, Charles had a big and powerful body and was tall but well proportioned. That his height was 7 times the length of his own feet is well known, and so people believe that means he might have been like 6'4" or something. Considering his father was really tiny, that makes it a little bit interesting as well. He had a round head, his eyes were unusually large and lively, his nose a little longer than average, his gray hair attractive, and his face cheerful and friendly. Whether he was standing or sitting, his appearance was always impressive and dignified. His neck was somewhat short and thick, and his stomach protruded a little, but this was rendered inconspicuous by the good proportion of the rest of his body. So even when he's trying to say he might be a little bit overweight, he's kind of doing it in a nice way. So why is this important? Because, when you look at primary sources, you have to think of biases. And while in this source, at least, we see a lot of very positive descriptions of Charlemagne, it's important to know that he was his official biographer. They were friends. And so, was he as ideal as what we have in this source? This is something that, if you take an upper division history course, you'd probably go into even more detail on. But at the very least, I want you to be aware that when you read this source, there's definitely examples through it where he's putting him in a very positive light. Now, regardless, even without that, we do know Charlemagne had a number of really important achievements. So let's go through some of the key achievements of Charlemagne. One of the most important was, of course, his conquests. Charlemagne, as you can see on this map, is going to expand a lot of territory for the Frankish kingdom. As you can see on this map here, you have the light green color. Those are areas pre-Charlemagne. And then you see everything in the dark green are areas that he expanded to. So he moves down into Italy over here. And there in Italy, of course, he's going to defeat one of the Germanic tribes, the Lombards over there, as you can see. So he defeats the Lombards there. And so that's one thing he's going to do. He's also, when he does that, takes the title King of the Lombards as well. So he's like Charles the Great, King of the Franks, King of the Lombards. He conquers the area of Saxony. And who's in Saxony? Well, of course, the Saxons. So in my other previous lectures, I talk about the various Germanic tribes. The Saxons were one of them. Interestingly, one way he justifies conquering and actually killing quite a few of them is he says they were pagan and therefore they need to be done away with. So, that's something we know about Charlemagne as well. He conquers this kind of northern part of Spain as well. One thing we get from that is a little epic story called the Song of Roland, which is a kind of this epic tale that comes from this time, or comes a little bit later actually. It's not written during the time of Charlemagne, but this Song of Roland is a story that we get that comes from his conquest of Spain. And then he also takes over what you see these tributary people. And these tributary people over here, what does that mean? Well, they're people who basically pay tribute to Charlemagne. So why this is so significant in terms of the land and the conquest that he holds is Charlemagne, if you take all of these together, and let me show you kind of in another map here. I kind of like this map a little bit more because when you take all the colors together, the kind of teal and the greens and this kind of puke green color, and you start to, let me use a different color here. And you start to kind of circle that whole region over here, right? What is that? Well, that starts to look a lot like what was once the Western Roman Empire. And so, in terms of his conquest, Charlemagne is going to do something that hasn't been done since 476, which is not completely, but in a large part, reunite what was Western Rome, right? He doesn't, of course, have Spain, he doesn't have England, but a good chunk of what was Western Rome, or Britain, I should say, is now conquered by Charlemagne. So this is one reason he's important, because he reestablishes this entire West in one power. But the other thing is, by creating this much land, what we're eventually going to see through his heirs, it's through the heirs of Charlemagne that you're going to end up with two little countries we still have today, France and Germany. And I'll probably have a different lecture on that as well. But that's kind of an interesting part in terms of the long-term effects of the Carolingian Empire, right? So what else? Well, one of the really important things that happens during the reign of Charlemagne, as I mentioned, he reunites the western part of what was the Western Roman Empire, and then he wants the title of Holy Roman Emperor. So this is an interesting story that, again, Einhard talks about. So we have a source by Einhard, and he talks about how Charlemagne is going to take this title of Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800 AD. And I'm actually going to read just a bit of this, because I think when you read it and you think about it, it's a pretty interesting story. So this is what Einhard says. Just follow along here for a second. He says, but there was another reason for Charles's last visit to Rome. The Romans, who had forced Pope Leo, on whom they inflicted various injuries like tearing out his eyes and cutting out his tongue, to beg for the king's assistance. Charles therefore went to Rome to put order to the confused situation and reestablish the status of the church. This took the whole winter. It was on this occasion that he accepted the title of Emperor and Augustus, which at first he disliked so much that he said he would not have even entered the church, even on this highest of holy days, December 25th, if he had beforehand realized the intentions of the Pope. So, according to Einhard, Charles really didn't want the coronation. Now, anybody who really knows much about Charlemagne would dispute that. And I would dispute that because Charlemagne loved titles, and as we're going to see later on, he had no problem with his son having this title. And the reason, of course, is why is Einhard saying, oh, I really didn't want it? My guess, he's trying to make him look humble and all of that. So this is where understanding the source, I think, gives you a better perspective of what's really going on here. Now, the other part of this story is how the coronation took place. And so this guy, Pope Leo III, he's going to have the coronation. Now, I brought me a little crown here to demonstrate. And one of two things can happen here, right? Either the Pope can approach Charlemagne with the crown. Charlemagne can take the crown and put it on his own head. Ta-da! Or, always can be a little silly studying history, right? Or the Pope takes the crown and puts it on Charlemagne's head directly, which is what probably happened. Now, why is that important that the Pope put the crown on Charlemagne's head? Well, this goes to a whole big part of the theme of the Middle Ages, which is the power of the church in the Middle Ages. And this is, in a way, kind of the church putting its supremacy and trying to show, hey, I am giving you the crown, you're not taking it. And, I always make this point. This story comes back about 1,000 years later, because about 1,000 years later, this little guy named Napoleon, he's going to take the title of emperor, and when he does, and the Pope approaches him, the story is very clear that Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope's hand, puts it on his own head, and doesn't even give a chance the Pope to do it, because he wanted to make sure he was in charge and he was in control. So this is kind of a whole other little story I cover a lot in my Middle Ages history, when I cover the Middle Ages and the power of the church and the various institution at the time. But this story is, I think, a good example of that. All right. So what else? Is Charlemagne done? Well, again, he's full of energy. By the way, he had 5 wives as well, I believe. Not all at the same time. And he's, doing a lot of things, conquering a lot of land. He's not done. He's going to build things. Aix-la-Chapelle, a place in Aachen, 796. He begins the building of this cathedral, or chapel, I should say. And, what's interesting, of course, about this is during this kind of Dark Age period, I have a short lecture, if you haven't seen it, on the Dark Ages, you don't see many of these monuments, huge monuments built in the West. And it's interesting because when you talk about when did the Dark Ages end, And a lot of historians say, oh, the Dark Ages end around the year 1000 AD. And I actually kind of differ a little bit. I go, I think it's really closer to 800 AD, because by then you got Charlemagne reuniting the much of the Western Empire. He's building these, this massive monument. So I think it does begin to show that the West is kind of coming out a bit of its dark ages. We're still in the Middle Ages, but I think that's kind of an interesting just kind of phenomenon seeing that. It's not only this, he also is part of what we call the Carolingian Renaissance. And the Carolingian Renaissance is another important point of the reign of Charlemagne. It's, not the Renaissance. Usually when you think of the Renaissance in the 14, 15, 1600s, you think Michelangelo and Leonardo and Italy and Florence and all that. This is the Carolingian Renaissance many years earlier, but there's at least an attempt to create these scriptoriums, places where people can go and learn to write. We get these illuminated manuscripts. This is just one example of an illuminated manuscript, beautiful books and so forth. So there is at least an attempt to increase places of learning and education. Ironically, Charlemagne himself, even according to Einhard, is not described as being very literate, that he could barely read. He learned it later in life, never really learned how to write well. So that's kind of pretty telling as well, that one of the more famous people in history was not very literate. So there it is. Charlemagne does a lot of things, and I want to kind of keep it relatively short so I can kind of give you a lot of detail in a short time so you can learn a lot about this one man. Obviously, there's a lot more. Again, I'll share the link of Einhard in the details here so you can find it if you want to learn more about him. But other than that, I hope that was interesting. Of course, always feel free to share these lectures with anyone. I always like sharing this knowledge. And that's it. If you have any questions, please let me know. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.